Welcome to the Medical Billing Blueprint podcast, where we break down the complexities of medical billing, revenue cycle management, and healthcare compliance. Join us as we explore strategies, tips, and industry insights to help doctors, practice managers, and medical staff optimize their billing processes and boost practice revenue. Let's get it right with the Billing Blueprint.
Okay, so
Imagine spending years, pouring your heart into building your healthcare practice, and then bam.
out of nowhere, a tiny little billing error you didn't even know about
Right.
lands you this massive fine
Yeah.
that has you
Oh, yeah.
panicking.
Absolutely.
Talk about a punch to the gut, right?
It really drives home why having a solid compliance plan in healthcare today is so essential.
It's not just something nice to have. It's mission critical.
Yeah.
And it's not just about avoiding those penalties.
Although, let's be real, that's a huge sigh of relief for most people. It's
Yeah.
really about building that safety net of trust for everybody involved.
Exactly. Who wants to feel vulnerable, especially with something as important as healthcare, right?
Yeah, absolutely. But before we get into all the nitty-gritty steps,
Yeah.
let's take a step back for a second.
What exactly are we even talking about when we say compliance plan?
Because that always sounds a little intimidating to me, like
Yeah.
a mountain of paperwork.
I totally get it. Compliance isn't exactly the most exciting word.
But it's helpful to think of it less like drowning in paperwork
Right.
and more like we're talking about the backbone of your practice,
It's the framework that keeps everything aligned.
both legally and ethically.
Okay, so less about checking boxes and more about making it part of your practice's DNA.
Exactly.
I like that.
It's about creating a culture, a system.
So we're talking HIPAA for patient privacy, obviously.
Right.
Making sure your billing practices are squeaky clean when it comes to Medicare and Medicaid.
Even how your employees conduct themselves.
Well-
It's about building a culture of responsibility from the ground up.
So big picture stuff.
Yeah.
But this blog does a great job of breaking it down into manageable pieces.
It's kind of like that recipe you follow.
Yeah.
The one to guarantee your chocolate chip cookies come out perfect every single time.
What are our key ingredients here for a successful compliance plan?
First up, you have your compliance program policies.
Those are your foundational elements.
Think of it like the flour, the sugar, the butter of the recipe.
Okay.
You have to establish crystal clear guidelines
And I mean for everything.
from how you handle patient information to billing procedures.
Makes sense. You can't exactly bake without a recipe.
Right.
So then there's training.
Right. We got to make sure all of our staff know that recipe by heart
Yes.
and can bake those perfect compliance cookies every time.
Absolutely. Regular training and education is key.
Your staff has to be able to understand and actually implement these policies you've put in place.
And like any good baker, we have to keep an eye on the oven.
Make sure the temperature's just right.
Right.
That's where the whole internal monitoring and auditing comes in.
Exactly.
We're talking about regularly reviewing your practices
Catching any potential issues early.
and just generally ensuring everything's running smoothly.
And just in case those cookies start to burn,
Yes.
we need a way to flag it quickly.
Okay, absolutely.
That's where a clear reporting system is essential.
You got it.
Having that accessible system in place for anyone to report a potential issue is critical.
I love this analogy.
It really helps to break it down.
We've got a good understanding now of what a compliance plan is.
But let's talk about why it really truly matters.
And I'm not just talking about dodging those hefty fines,
Oh, yeah.
although those are definitely a motivating factor.
Of course, no one wants to deal with that.
But let's think about it from the patient's perspective for a second.
Wouldn't you feel better knowing that your healthcare provider
Yeah.
is really committed to ethical practices?
And handles your sensitive information carefully.
Absolutely.
I mean, think about it.
Would you feel comfortable
Yeah.
knowing that they're just kind of throwing those regulations to the side? Especially in healthcare. I feel like trust is everything.
100%.
A strong compliance plan shows your patients that you care.
That you prioritize their well-being,
Yes.
that you respect their privacy.
In fact, there was a study done by, name of organization, e.g. Ponemon Institute, recently.
And they found that patients are way more likely to switch providers.
Like, statistic from research, 60% more likely
Wow.
to switch after a data breach.
That's huge.
So it's not just about checking boxes.
Right.
It's about protecting your reputation and building that trust with your patients.
That long-term trust.
Absolutely.
And it's not just about the patients either.
The blog makes a good point about how A really strong compliance plan
Yeah,
creates a safer and more transparent workplace for your staff, too.
for sure.
That protects everyone.
Because when your employees feel supported,
And they know what the rules are.
yeah,
They're going to feel way more comfortable raising any concerns they
Ah.
might have,
absolutely.
which is so important.
It creates that environment where everyone's on the same page, working towards a common goal. And it seems like the folks over at CMS agree with us.
That's the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, for anyone who's new here.
Right.
They seem to be pretty big on the whole compliance thing.
Yeah, they are
They actually have a whole section of their website.
dedicated to compliance resources just for healthcare providers.
Really?
It emphasizes how important CMS thinks this is for ethical healthcare.
So they're taking it seriously.
Yeah, and they even have a dedicated hotline.
For reporting any potential fraud, waste, or abuse.
Wow, okay, so it's obvious that compliance is non-negotiable.
But knowing you need a plan
Right.
and actually sitting down and building one out,
Yeah.
those can feel like two very different things.
Where do we even begin? It gives you this really practical roadmap.
To building your compliance fortress, step by step.
Okay, that's reassuring because honestly, it can feel a little overwhelming at times.
So what's the first brick we're laying in this compliance fortress?
All right, so step one is to assess where you're at right now.
Assess your current practices.
And the key here is this isn't a one and done kind of thing.
You don't just do it once and forget about it.
Right.
It's more like,
You know, getting regular checkups.
okay.
You're making sure your compliance program's healthy.
So staying vigilant, staying ahead of any potential problems.
Exactly.
What would that look like in the real world?
Like, give me a for instance.
Let's say you have a new receptionist
Okay.
and they're not super familiar with all the HIPAA regulations yet.
And they accidentally leave a patient's file open on the front desk.
Oh, no.
Not good.
Right. Or maybe your practice just got a brand new electronic health record system.
But you haven't updated your data security measures yet.
These are the types of things you'd want to be looking for during those assessments.
Identifying any areas where things might be a little outdated
Yes,
or maybe not quite aligned with the latest regulations.
exactly.
Okay, so we've done our checkup. We've identified any potential weak spots. What comes next?
Next, you need to appoint a compliance officer.
Or even a whole committee if you have the bandwidth for that.
And this isn't just about, assigning someone to file paperwork.
Right.
It's about having a dedicated person or team.
Really championing compliance within your organization.
It's like having someone whose job it is to live and breathe this stuff.
Yes, someone who owns it.
This person or team, they're responsible for developing those policies.
Conducting training, overseeing audits.
Basically making sure compliance is woven into the very fabric of your practice.
They're like the compliance quarterback,
I like,
calling the plays.
yes.
Okay, so we've got our game plan. We've got our quarterback.
Now we need the playbook.
Right.
And that's where policies and procedures come in, right?
Exactly. This is where you outline all those essential details.
Of how your practice will handle the nitty-gritty of compliance.
Okay, so like what exactly are we talking about here?
So for example, let's say a patient asks to review their medical records.
You need a clear policy for that.
Or what if there's a security breach involving patient data?
Ugh, that's scary to even think about.
But so important to be prepared for.
Exactly. You have to have a procedure in place.
This is where it can feel really overwhelming. Like, how do you even know if you've covered all your bases?
That's where that initial assessment comes in handy.
Remember that first step we talked about?
Right.
Use that assessment.
Pinpoint the areas where you need those crystal clear policies and procedures.
Okay, so it's all about connecting the dots.
Yes.
Are there any tools or resources out there? Absolutely.
Mm.
There are some fantastic resources online
You can find sample policy templates.
from really reputable organizations.
Oh, that's a relief.
You don't have to reinvent the wheel.
Exactly.
But these policies and procedures, we can't just frame them and hang on the wall, right?
No, definitely not.
The world of healthcare compliance is constantly changing.
Oh, tell me about it.
So you have to be ready to adapt.
Your policies and procedures have to evolve too.
So regular reviews are key.
Yes.
Make sure you're reviewing and updating them to reflect any changes in regulations, best practices, even your own internal processes.
Got it. So it's all about staying flexible and up to date.
Exactly.
Okay, so we've got our playbook drafted.
It's time to get our team ready for the big game.
Training time.
Absolutely. Training is essential.
And not those boring check-the-box training sessions either.
No.
We're talking engaging interactive sessions.
We need to get your staff thinking critically about compliance.
And how it applies to their everyday work.
Because what good is a policy
Exactly.
if no one knows how to use it?
Exactly. It's got to be relevant to them.
And keep in mind, the training needs to be tailored too.
Okay?
A billing specialist needs different information than a nurse, right?
Makes sense.
Or receptionists.
So it's all about making it relevant to each person's role.
Yes.
Let's say, for example, I'm a physician.
Small practice, and I'm just starting to dip my toes into the world of telemedicine.
Okay.
What's a specific policy I need to train my staff on?
That's a great question. With telemedicine, you'd need a crystal clear policy on protecting patient information during those virtual sessions.
Since you're not face-to-face, those virtual interactions come with their own set of considerations.
Okay, so walk me through it.
For example, you might decide to use a specific video conferencing platform.
One that's HIPAA compliant
Makes sense.
and has that end-to-end encryption.
You'll also need a procedure for verifying the patient's identity.
And getting their consent before you even start the telemedicine session.
It's interesting because it's like the same principles of in-person care, but applied to this whole new way of delivering healthcare.
Exactly, and you absolutely need to train your staff on those specific platforms and procedures.
Those details matter.
So it's not enough to just say, hey, HIPAA is this. You
Yeah.
really have to break it down.
It's got to be practical.
Okay, so practical training tailored to each role.
Yes.
What else should we keep in mind when it comes to training?
Oh, and don't forget documentation.
Document everything.
Why is that so important?
Well, if you ever get audited,
Those records are going to be your best friend.
they want to see that paper trail.
Exactly.
Okay, so we've got our policies in place. Our team is trained up.
We're documenting like crazy.
What's next?
Now it's time to implement those monitoring systems.
Remember those regular checkups we talked about?
Right.
This is where they come into play.
So regular audits to make sure everything's running smoothly?
Yes,
Everyone's following the playbook?
precisely. But it's not just about catching mistakes.
Oh.
It's also about identifying what's working well.
And celebrating those wins.
Those little victories can go a long way.
It's about constantly trying to improve then.
You got it.
It's a continuous loop of improvement.
And that's how we adapt to this ever-changing world of healthcare regulations.
Exactly. Which, speaking of,
Yes.
we should probably touch on that before we wrap up this part of our deep dive.
You're right. The blog really emphasized how much healthcare regulations are constantly changing.
They are.
It's not like you can just set it and forget it.
Yeah, not at all.
So how can practices stay ahead of the curve?
It really is a lot to keep up with. So how can practices, especially smaller ones, stay ahead of the curve here?
That's a great question.
And it brings us to one of the most important parts of any good compliance program.
Okay, lay it on me.
You have to be proactive.
Okay. Easier said than done sometimes.
It's true. But this gives us some really solid strategies.
It emphasizes how crucial it is to use reliable resources and stay in the loop.
So basically, subscribing to every healthcare compliance newsletter out there.
Well,
My inbox is already overflowing as it is.
I hear you. It doesn't have to be information overload.
Start with a few really trustworthy sources.
Okay, so like what are we talking about?
Industry newsletters for sure.
Uh-huh.
Professional organizations are always a good bet.
Makes sense.
And even government websites.
Oh, right, like that CMS website we were talking about
Ex-
earlier.
Exactly.
Okay, so quality over quantity when it comes to information sources.
100%.
And don't underestimate the power of networking.
Oh, that's a good point.
Connect with other practices in your area.
Go to those industry conferences.
Even if you can just pick the brain of another compliance officer you really admire.
I love that.
Sharing knowledge and experience is so valuable.
Two heads are better than one,
Right? Exactly.
especially when it comes to compliance.
For sure. And speaking of tapping into expertise.
Don't be afraid to consult with actual legal professionals.
Oh, yeah, the lawyers.
Exactly, the ones who specialize in healthcare compliance.
They can give you guidance on those really specific regulations.
So helpful.
They can even review your policies.
And help you navigate those tricky situations that pop up.
It's like having a compliance lawyer on speed dial.
Exactly. Think of them as your allies.
I like it. Okay, so just to recap here for a second.
We've talked about doing that initial assessment.
Appointing our compliance all-star.
Yes.
Drafting those essential policies.
Training our team.
Regular checkups.
Staying in the loop on all the latest and greatest.
What am I forgetting?
There's one more thing we should touch on,
It often gets overlooked.
especially in today's digital world.
Okay, you've got me on the edge of my seat here.
Business associate agreements.
BAAs, right? I've had those thrown around.
Exactly.
Can you refresh my memory, though?
Of course.
What are they all about?
So in the simplest terms, a BAA is a legally binding contract.
Oh, serious stuff.
It's between your practice and any third-party vendor who handles protected health information
PHI.
on your behalf. Exactly.
So this is about making sure we're covered from all sides when it comes to patient information.
Yes, even if someone outside your practice is handling it.
That makes a lot of sense.
And think about it, so many practices use third-party vendors these days.
Oh, absolutely.
Billing companies, cloud storage, electronic prescriptions.
It's hard to imagine healthcare functioning without them at this point.
It really is.
And while these vendors might have their own compliance programs in place,
Right.
you need that BAA
It ensures everyone's on the same page.
when it comes to protecting PHI,
Yes, exactly.
creating that chain of trust.
You got it.
Okay, so it's better to have these agreements in place up front
100%.
rather than scrambling after something happens.
Always better to be safe than sorry.
Okay, so we've covered a ton of ground today.
We have.
We explored what it takes to build a truly strong compliance program.
And we even touched on those often overlooked BAAs. But I think the biggest takeaway here is that compliance is all about protecting what matters.
Your patients, your staff, the integrity of your practice.
I love that. So, as we wrap up this deep dive.
I want to leave our listeners with a final thought-provoking question.
Okay.
We've gone through all the steps, all the boxes to check.
But how can you make compliance more than just a checklist item?
How can we weave it into the very fabric of our practices?
That's the million-dollar question.
And the answer is going to be a little different for everyone.
But I think it starts with a shift in how we see compliance.
It's not a burden.
It's a core value.
It's a promise to do right by our patients and our team.
Beautifully said. It's about creating a culture where everyone feels ownership.
Yes.
A culture of awareness, responsibility, and continuous improvement.
Exactly.
And remember, you're not alone in this.
Lean on those resources. Connect with your peers. Don't be afraid to ask those questions.
And celebrate those wins along the way.
Yes.
This is a journey.
Not a destination.
Absolutely. On that note, this deep dive has come to an end.
We hope you found it insightful and empowering.
Until next time, keep learning, keep growing, and keep diving deep into the world of healthcare.